Well, good morning. I want to start off with a shout out to my wife for putting together that sermon bumper that got me hyped up right there. Sure, clap for my wife. I am so excited to be here this morning because, guys, we made it. We did it. We're here at the end of this school year. We made it through like the having to have ropes and stuff. We just made it, guys. Who's excited to be here right now? Yeah. It feels kind of like we've come through a bit of a rough season, understatement of the year. But today I'm excited because it's like there's nothing but light at in front of us. There's no more. Maybe we're not out of the woods yet, but like there aren't that many trees left. I don't need to say any more about that. I'm excited to be here this morning because I get to talk about something. Like usually when I'm up here, I feel like anxious that, oh man, I'm only going to have like 10 minutes of things to say and then we're going to be done, which never happens. I don't know why I'm anxious about that. But this particular topic, I have the opposite problem. It's like last night I was hanging out with Adam and I was like, all right, man, you're going to have to take a hatchet to my notes because this is going to be like an hour and a half. So we cut out a good 5 to 10 minutes and, no, I'm kidding. We're going to talk about young people today. It's graduation Sunday, senior Sunday, and we haven't done one of these in a while. If you remember last year, we had this thing, like a pandemic going on, so we didn't get to have our normal senior Sunday. But 2 years ago, if you were here, you will probably remember that I talked about the differences in generations. If you were here, if you weren't here, you can join along too. You probably have heard some of this. But I want to go over and do just a little recap. I like to do this when we start. If you are a traditionalist or a member of the golden generation, do you know who you are? Raise your hand if you know who you are. Raise them proud. No, none of that meek, like, all the way up. Yeah, thank you, yes. We're doing, I'm going to hit every generation. So if you don't know, maybe Google it real quick before I get there. You guys, traditionalists or the golden generation, this is my grandparents' generation. So don't worry, I have nothing but great things to say about you guys. This is anyone who was alive during World War II is part of this generation. And this generation is marked by some pretty hard things like Great Depression, World War II. This generation is known for kind of coming to the table with a posture of being willing and able to sacrifice maybe what they want for what's best for everyone. This is what this generation is marked at. And after those guys, do we know who comes next? Where are my boomers at? Okay, boomer, raise your hand. Let's see the boomers, baby boomers. When those soldiers came back from World War II, man, they were real excited to see their sweethearts. And we had a boom of babies, right? This is a fun fact. You might not know this. The baby boomers are known as the me generation. Pretty big switch from the generation before them. We had the sacrifice for the greater good. They came back, and then this generation had the opportunity to think a lot more about myself, right? This is a generation marked by suburbs and prosperity and color television that you only had. How many channels did you guys grow up? Boomers, did you have 4, 3, 4, 2? Depends on who you ask, 3. So the thing about only having 3 channels is that everyone pretty much watches the same thing, right? And when a whole country watches pretty much the same thing on TV, then you have a very similar experience. You understand what I mean? So boomers have a pretty narrow field of a lot of things compared to the generations before them because they didn't have the plurality of choices like we generations after them had. So after the boomers come Gen Xers. Who's Gen X in here? Oh, sorry. Boomers is right after World War II to about 1964. So Gen X, 1965 through 1983, 84, somewhere in there. If you're born in there, where are my Gen Xers? Sorry. Raise your hands loud and proud. You guys are the cynical ones. That's what you're known as. Hey, listen, cynical's better than my generation, so just be thankful that you get cynical. You guys, you are known for growing up in the world of no-fault divorce. All of a sudden, you can get divorced for without what would, you need like a good reason before you can get divorced. So we have broken families on a scale that we've never seen before. And not only that, we have things like Watergate, where we're seeing politicians like lie on TV, and this generation just became cynical of the man. You know what I'm talking about? This is a cynical generation. And then Gen X gave way to, where are my millennials at? This is me, millennials. This was the smallest group in last service too. Really? There's only like 6 of us in here. Oh man. Whatever. Okay, millennials, we got to step it up. So millennials, we're known as the entitled generation. So much so, no. Your kid's not a millennial. Okay, so you don't have to agree so aggressively, geez. So, funny thing, as a millennial, there is nothing we can do to shake this reputation. If you didn't know, most millennials are out of college, have careers, and kids by now. But when a lot of people think millennial, they just think young people, right? Or I had a conversation with one of my friends last week who was a boomer, and I mentioned millennial, and he's like, "Oh, what do you mean when you say millennial?" I was like, "I mean what the word means." People born in this region. He's like, "Oh, well, when I think millennial, I just think of somebody who's entitled. Somebody who wants everyone to pay for everything for them. That's what I think of." I'm like, well, that's not what that means. But that's what people think. And funny thing, last week I spent some time with my sister and my brother-in-law. They just had another baby. They have 2 now. One is 1.5 years, and one is 3 weeks old. And our job was to take care of the 1.5-year-old so they could tend to the baby and not sleep and stuff like that. So we did this fun thing where we watched some of the shows that we grew up with. And does anybody remember Barney in here? Who knows Barney in here? Yeah. So we watched Barney, and I wrote down some of the lyrics because I thought this was pretty telling. Barney saying, "You are special. You're the only one like you. You are special. You're the only one who can do the things you do." And I was really surprised whenever this Barney stuff came on, because I haven't even thought about Barney in 20 years. But we watched an hour and 15 long Barney special, and I knew the words to every single song. It was locked away in a part of my brain that I haven't accessed for 2 decades, but it was still there. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about generations. The thing that separates us as generations is what we experience for the first 15, 20 years of our life really becomes the filter through which we see the world moving forward. It sticks with us, and even if we don't consciously think about it, the words to Barney, the airplane, sitting in the airplane, staring out the window, watching the clouds go by, sitting in the airplane, and the green grass grows. You guys know what I'm talking about? Even though we don't access these memories, they're there, and that becomes it's our worldview. Those are the glasses that we see and carry with us through the rest of our lives. And today what I want to do is a couple different things. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to Gen Z. Gen Z, I didn't talk about very much last time. A lot of the jury was still out on this generation, but we've had some pretty telling research come in just in the last couple months even. And I want to introduce you to these guys. I want to talk about what makes them tick, kind of what they've experienced. I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list. We don't have time for that. This is a survey class today. So we're going to talk about some things that what are the marks of Gen Z, and then we're going to talk about how do we make disciples of this new generation. If you don't know what I'm talking about with Gen Z, anybody never heard of Gen Z before? It's possible. Gen Z is anyone college age down right now is Gen Z. Now, there will probably be a marker sometime from now, the last couple years, those kids born in that area will probably be called something else. My guess is the pandemic might be if you're born after pandemic, then you're this generation. But we don't know that yet. So I'll come back in 5 or 10 years and we'll talk about them. But let's talk about Gen Z for a little bit. Let me introduce you to Gen Z. Gen Z is actually a really cool generation. There are things that like, I work with these guys on a daily basis, and I'm so proud to watch them. They see the world in such an interesting way. It's different, but I think there are a lot of cool things. The first thing I want to talk about is how Gen Z is success-oriented. Gen Z is success-oriented. If you know a Gen Zer, there's a good chance that they are hardworking and driven, ambitious. Maybe not in the thing you want them to be, but in something. They're most likely a driven person. Back when I was in school, and I'm assuming when most of you were in school, there was a group of people who like really, really cared about their schoolwork. Like they were, it was all, I gotta do well so I can succeed, so I can have a great future. And we called that group of people like the tryhards or the nerds, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? But that's like the rule today. Instead of the exception, that is the rule. That's what most kids are like. They have really high expectations for themselves. And part of the reason is they see some pretty big obstacles in front of them. Things like, what are we going to do about climate change? What are we going to do about energy crisis? What happens when we run out of fossil fuels? What are we going to do with this world that is increasingly covered in plastics, in those little microplastics that apparently get in the fish and you eat and it's bad for you and they're in babies? And what are we going to do about income inequality and racial tension? There are a lot of big hurdles that this generation is going to have to overcome. They have high expectations for themselves. The second mark of this generation is they're really diverse. In fact, they're the fastest growing demographic in this generation is multiracial. The minorities of yesterday are becoming the majority of today. For the last however many years, since the 1700s, do you guys know what the most popular name in America is? I hear whispers. Somebody yell out loud. Smith. That's right. I'm married to one of them. They're everywhere. You can't get around them. But today, the most popular last name is Rodriguez. That's a big shift, right? That's something new. That's something different. And we're seeing in this generation a total acceptance and even elevation of non-white, non-males in a way that's completely new. And I think it's really cool to see people embracing differences in a way that, like, we're no longer scared of the things that make us different. We're trying to, this generation is doing their best to embrace those, and I think it's really cool to watch. Third thing I want to say about Gen Z is they are digitally connected. If you have met a Gen Zer, you know that their native language is technology, right? Most of us, it's like that Batman quote, like, you were merely adopted into the darkness. I was born into it, molded by it, right? Gen Zers speak technology as their first language. And if you've ever had trouble with your phone, you ever had your phone like, oh no, I can't read it now, it's got too small, or change it to Dutch language, or your TV is stuck on the Latin channel for 3 days, and you're like, I don't even know what to do. And then your grandson or somebody comes over and they're like, oh, you just got to do this. And then they perform some sort of magic miracle to make it go back to normal like nothing ever happened. You guys know what I'm talking about? Technology is their second language. They couldn't even be held down by a pandemic, right? The whole pandemic, we're not allowed to leave their house, and they just went on with school as usual. As a very big overstatement, it was pretty rough. But they were still able to move forward in the pandemic in ways that we would not have been able to before. And the last thing that I think is really cool about Gen Z is the fact that they are emotionally engaged. Gone are the days of cry on the inside like a winner and repressing the thing. Instead of doing the emotional equivalent of putting a sticker on the warning light, like the change oil light on your dash, they're actually saying maybe I should deal with this. Maybe let's talk about mental health. Let's talk about my emotional health. How can I deal with these things instead of just pretending that this hurt or whatever doesn't exist inside of me? And the fact that they're emotionally engaged, I think that they're asking questions like, how does this make me feel? Why does it make me feel that way? They're asking, how do my actions make other people feel? And because of this, I think we're seeing a generation that has a much higher compassion quotient than some of the generations before. I've been super impressed just by how much people care in this generation about other people. But the reality is, even though a generation has good things, right? Each generation has good and bads. Any good thing taken too far can become a bad thing. Maybe not any good thing, most good things. And although there are a lot of really cool things about Gen Z, these cool things have a shadow side to them. So let's talk about that. Even though this generation is really success-oriented, this generation is also tired, anxious, and pessimistic. They're so wrapped up in being busy and doing more and being successful and like cultivating whatever the college they want to go to wants to see. They're so busy wrapped up, they don't know how to rest. They don't know what it looks like to have a healthy relationship with work and productivity. It's go, go, go all the time, and we're seeing a generation that's just being burnt out like crazy. In fact, if you ask, in surveys where they ask Gen Zers, the most common negative emotion that comes back is just tired. They're just so burnt out because they don't know how to manage the gas pedal and the brake pedal in their life. They're also pessimistic because even though they're preparing for the best, they're expecting the worst. It feels like they're coming of age and going into a system that is rigged against them, right? Just over the last year or so during this pandemic, where most people are dealing with things like food insecurity and unemployment, right? Having to move because you can't afford your rent. While normal people are dealing with those things, they see the billionaire class like double their net worth, right? It seems like the guys at the top have rigged the system against the guys at the bottom. They're watching my generation ahead of them, try to do their best to go out in the workforce and having to move back home because it's not working. Who in here knows a millennial who had to move back in home with their parents, right? It seems like they're going into a world that is rigged against them. With the diversity comes a lot of new challenges that we haven't quite figured out yet. In fact, we're moving in the direction of like accepting all types of people, but what you find is when you put all types of people together, there's some worldviews that don't really mesh very well. And what does it look like for us to be accepting of people and to have relationships with all kinds of people whenever our thoughts and expectations don't line up? Right? There's a lot of challenges that they're going to have to overcome. With the digital connection, as soon as I said digital connection, most of you probably heard that as a bad thing, right? There's a lot of good in that, but there is a lot of bad in that. You could probably all come up here and give your list of bad things from digital connection. For instance, we are addicted to technology in a crazy way, in a way that it's like we've kind of just ignored that this is happening. In fact, we know that whenever you use things like social media, right? Whenever you post a picture and you get likes, or whenever you're bored and you like send out 30 texts where you're like, hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? When you start getting responses to that fires off a dopamine hit in your brain. If you don't know what dopamine is the same chemical that we get a dump from when we gamble, when we smoke, and when we drink alcohol. And all three of those things have age restrictions on them. We know, like, hey, we don't want to expose our young people to this at a young age because the addiction thing, like, if you've met an alcoholic, odds are their first experience with alcohol happened when they were too young. And they found out that there's a way I can cope with this. There's a numbing effect of something that can either, like, distract me or just take away the pain in general. And we've essentially opened up this metaphorical liquor cabinet and said, here, good luck, young people. We also see when we take this emotional engagement too far, we found that we have a generation that is emotionally fragile, emotionally weak. When we spend so much time like asking ourselves, how will this make this person feel? We move in the direction of like, if it's going to make them feel bad, then I'm not going to do it. And when we go that far, we go down that path so far, we find ourselves believing this idea that if it's offensive, then it must be wrong. And the problem is, like, truth hurts sometimes. For us to grow, for us to learn, we need that process of like the clashing of ideas where I think this and you think this, and it's like, no, you're wrong here, and no, you missed this. Like that's a really important process on growing intellectually and emotionally. Like, we're missing out on a lot because we've become a little emotionally weak. We're a little fragile. We need safe spaces. We need trigger warnings. And when we spend so much time with this idea that if it's offensive, it's wrong, we get to a place of relativism where we all get to just pick what we want to believe, right? Doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe in something. You heard that before, right? And it's really hard to do life when we don't have any sort of standard of good and evil. We don't know, like, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. But to know what hurts people, you have to know what is good and what is not good. And when I look at this, this is the soil in which we're trying to plant the seeds of discipleship in the young generation. And I think there are a lot of obstacles. I think it's actually kind of hard. And in fact, I believe that we're not doing very well. The church in America in general is not doing super well. I've said this statistic from this stage like 20 times, that by the time the students that we have, like the ones who are engaged, part of our church, part of our youth group, by the time they hit high school graduation, about 75% of them are going to walk away from our faith. Not just here in CCC, like the church in America. We also know that the highest growing demographic in this young generation is the nuns. You guys know the nuns? Not like Catholic nuns, but the N-O-N-E-S. The like, what's your religious affiliation? Is none. I don't have any. I'm not affiliated with anybody. It's kind of like I don't even think about it. It's not even on my radar. I'm not an atheist. I'm not agnostic. I'm not Catholic. I'm just nothing. Why waste my time with that? That's the largest growing demographic. Gen Z is twice as likely as any other generation to say that they're an atheist. We're not doing a great job making disciples of this generation. I think a lot of it is due to an assumption that we've made. It's not a new assumption. In fact, this assumption goes back as long as the people of God go back. As long as there has been a group of people known as the people of God, there has been an assumption made that just being around the people of God is enough to make someone into a person of God. Let me say that again. The assumption is that being around the people of God is enough to make someone into a person of God. Let me illustrate that by some phrases you've probably heard, like, I took them to church their whole life. I don't understand why it didn't stick, right? We drove them to youth group every week. Why didn't it stick? It's because we're assuming that just being around it is enough. Just being in the church, I don't think is enough. But I do believe that there's hope. I believe that, oh man, I skipped a part. This assumption, as long as there's been a group of people known as the people of God, Moses actually talked about this in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 6, we read, when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of goods you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. The assumption was that if our kids are here with us, they saw this happen, the assumption was that that's going to be enough. But if you've opened the Old Testament at all, you know that the tendency is not to drift toward God. In fact, it's the opposite. The tendency is to drift away from God. That happens over and over until God smacks somebody with a bat in the head. It's like, no, you need to fix this. And then they come back for a while, and then what happens again? They start to drift away. And the same thing is happening with us today. But, like I said a minute ago when I skipped a part, there is hope. So let's talk about hope for... There's hope for us both as individuals. I want to say this, as a parent, as a grandparent, as a mentor, as somebody who cares about young people, as somebody who just knows a young person, there is hope for us. There's something that we can do to help them move in the direction of God. And there's something we can do as a church as well. I'm going to talk about both of those. I want to talk about as individuals first. The hope that we have is actually comes from the passage right before the one that I read. It's like, hey, do this or else this happens, right? I read the or else this happens, but let's read the do this. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. To lean in here. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates. We're given this hope that spiritual conversations are somehow the key to creating a generation that does not forget. Having spiritual conversations, making it normal to talk about and think about life through the lens of what is my responsibility as a Jesus follower, is the thing that creates a lasting generation. When I talk about spiritual conversations, I know a lot of you are picturing like, all right, let's sit down. Now, if the Lord came back today, would you go to heaven or hell? It's probably hell, so we got some work to do. Like, I'm not talking about that kind of conversation. You've probably had that conversation or seen that conversation, and it does more bad than good, right? When I'm talking spiritual conversations, I'm talking like talk about anything through the lens of our spiritual work, like through the lens of being a Jesus follower. That's what spiritual conversations are. Let me give you a couple of examples. Defining what it means to succeed in life is a spiritual conversation. A conversation about the church and diversity and what are we going to do to live together. That's a spiritual conversation. A conversation about how to live and interact with technology in a way that's healthy. Guess what? That's a spiritual conversation. A conversation about how to handle our emotions, how to be an emotionally healthy person, how to respond and like interact with people who maybe aren't emotionally healthy. Those are all spiritual conversations. Any of us can do this. And this is super important, but this is the type of thing that we ignore. It's like they're on the list of things that are awkward to talk about. This is somehow at the top of our list, even though it's like the most important thing we can talk about. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to move on to our hope for the church. As a church, I think there's something we can do to create a lasting faith in this generation. Paul talks about this in the book of Ephesians. If you don't know who Paul is a guy who, he wrote a good portion of our New Testament, and a lot of what he writes about is what it looks like to live as a part of the church, as a part of the body of Christ, as somebody who wants to be a Jesus follower. We're meant to do this in community. What does that community look like? And Paul talks to us here about how we reach maturity. This is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. So Christ gave himself, the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of church may be built up. Now, let me stop for a moment. The works of service here, in other translations, it says works of ministry. I like that better. I think it kind of encapsulates the idea here. The point of the people in like spiritual leadership is to equip people for the works of ministry, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. The best thing that we can do for our young people is to engage them, to equip them, and teach them what it looks like to be a part of the works of ministry. And I think it's easy for us to lose sight of this. The way we've done student ministry for the last 60 years is we separate them out. They go to a different place from the adults, and they have a service thing, and then, you come back together at your car, and then you drive home. And the reality is we can have a generation of people who have no connection to the church body outside of the student ministry. But what we want to develop, what we are gonna do is we're gonna orient our student ministry around this idea of equipping students for the works of ministry. What happens if we do that? Keep reading what Paul says. He says, then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him who the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. If we want to see young people leave the care of our church, of our parents, move on to the next phase of life with an unshakable faith, the kind of faith that is not tossed back and forth by the waves, engaging them in the ministry of our church body is the way we do that. So, I want to go circle back here and talk. How do we do this? First, as individuals, how do we have spiritual conversation? I got a couple tips here for you. The first thing is talk to people. Don't talk at people, right? We all know the difference. Somebody preaching at us versus somebody having a conversation with us. The goal here is to engage in conversations, right? The second thing, ask more questions than you give answers. We talk a lot as a student ministry. The idea that we say, it feels a little scary. We say we would rather have students who are able to process information and learn for themselves, to feed themselves. We'd rather have students leave our student ministry who know how to think. We'd rather have that than students who just have a list of all the right answers they're supposed to know, right? In our student ministry stuff, I could hand out just this packet of these are all the things you have to believe. And it's believe this about this and this about this. And we could just memorize that. But the problem is, if there's no connection between what you believe and why you believe it, it's not lasting, right? As soon as you have a conversation with somebody who's like, that's stupid, why do you believe that? And your honest answer is, I don't know. That's why we see students who walk away from their faith. They don't have a connection between the what and why. Let's move on. Third thing I have for you is be honest and vulnerable with your struggles. If you want to create a relationship of trust, a context of trust between you and somebody, the best way you can do it is to be honest and even vulnerable with the things that you struggle with. The easiest way you can create a lack of trust is to pretend that you're perfect, pretend that you never struggle with the things that the person you're talking to, I've never had to do that. I was just perfect my whole entire life. Why don't you try that, right? If you want to make sure that you are not the person that somebody comes to when they're struggling with something, is just pretend that you've never struggled with anything. But if we want to create trust, we have to be honest and vulnerable with the things that we've struggled with. And the last thing I have for you is don't avoid the hard conversations. Lean into the hard conversations. It's really tempting to somebody asks a hard question and it's how can I change the subject as fast as humanly possible, right? And the reality is, doubt is not the thing that kills faith, right? Doubt is one of those hard conversations. Doubt is not the thing that kills faith. Unprocessed doubt is the thing that kills faith. Doubt is an inevitability. We all have doubts from time to time. But the way that they become a real problem is if we don't address them and they just sit in our heart and they fester and they become an infection and eventually they kill our faith. Unprocessed doubt is the problem, not doubt. So, if those tips are not enough for you to try spiritual conversations, I want to invite you. Next week, Andy already talked about this. Next week, we're starting a class on Sunday morning called How to Have Spiritual Conversations. We're going to talk about why it's important to have spiritual conversations, what they're supposed to look like. We're going to practice some. We're going to send you home with some helpful conversation starters, hopefully, or we're going to do our best to do all these things, and we might not accomplish them perfectly, Honest with my struggles, not a perfect teacher. So that's what that's where I want to encourage you. Individually, we want to resource you. If you need help, come to this class. As a church, what we're going to do is we're changing the structure of our student ministry. We're going to reorient our student ministry around this idea that we need to engage our students in the works of ministry. The way we're doing that is you'll probably notice that there are young people in the room today, and they're not separated out into the loft where we used to do movement. There's a reason for that. I mean, COVID killed it. We stopped meeting because of COVID, but we didn't start it up because we want to change the way we do Sunday mornings with students. Rather than separating students out and have them just be a consumer of a young person thing, what we want to do is engage them and equip them to be a part of the ministry that's happening here at Cicero Christian Church. You've seen students on stage. We got a student in the crow's nest back there, Cal, right now, right? And we have signups all around the outside. This ministry fair, the hope is that you would encourage your students to sign up. Sign up as a family. We could do that. You can serve together as a family. We need to engage our young people in the process of ministry. Not just to be around us, but to be a part of us and what we're doing. So that's what we're going to do. Sign up to serve out there. All you have to do is walk 10 feet out the door, and there'll be something that you can sign up for. So I want to leave you with this. I know when I'm talking about spiritual conversations that there's a real temptation to say, but what if they ask something hard? I don't have all the answers. I'm not a Bible scholar. What if they ask something I don't know? I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm going to look dumb maybe, right? Maybe I'm going to do damage because I don't know. A couple years ago, Johns Hopkins did a study on raising test scores, right? They wanted to know, how do we raise reading scores? How do we get kids to read better? How do we get kids to do better in math? And they found out that the answer was one-on-one tutoring, one-on-one mentoring. And the assumption that you would make there is you put them in mentoring with somebody who was good at math. What they found is it didn't really matter how much you knew about math. The important thing was not your ability to answer all the questions. The thing that was important, the thing that most students, is just sitting across the table from another human person, looking in their eyes and seeing the expectation that forward progress is possible. Just the act of somebody believing in them is enough for them to believe in themselves and to take steps forward. And I think we can do the same thing as the church. The problem is not that we don't know all the answers or have everything to say. The problem is that we don't engage in spiritual conversations. So my challenge for you guys today is, as individuals, start having spiritual conversations with people. Just practice all the time. I was out with Jason a couple weeks ago, and he said, hey, let's try spiritual conversations. And then this girl sat down, and we just talked to her, and it was a really interesting conversation. And he caught me off guard. I felt a little awkward, but I felt way better at the end of it, right? Start having spiritual conversations, and if you have young people, if you know a young person, if you just see a young person, try to get them connected. Invite them to what you're doing, right? We need to engage our young people in this process of ministry. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for the opportunity to work with a generation that is cool like Gen Zers. God, I know that I don't always have the right answers. I don't always know what's best, but I do believe that you just ask us to be faithful. Be faithful with what we have, and you will respond with your will. So God, I just ask that we will all be encouraged this morning to be faithful in sharing our faith with younger people. Help us to engage in spiritual conversations. Help us to bring students into what we're doing. God, we know that just left to our default settings, drifting away is the most likely option. God, I pray that our hearts will break for those students who drift away. And I pray that we will be the kind of church who cares enough to do something about it. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.